What George Strait revealed about Jesus impacted everyone. The spotlights dimmed across the Grand Ole Opry House as the evening's most anticipated moment approached. Nashville's elite filled every seat, their conversations creating a low hum that echoed through the historic venue. Tonight wasn't just another awards ceremony. It was a celebration of 5 decades of country music excellence, and everyone knew who the evening's crown jewel would be. George Harvey Strait sat quietly in the front row, his weathered hands resting calmly on his knees. At 70 years old, the man they called the King of Country had seen countless nights like this. But something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the weight of the Lifetime Achievement Award waiting for him backstage, or perhaps it was the knowledge that this might be one of his final public appearances before he stepped further away from the spotlight. The whispers around him were familiar. 60 #1 hits, someone murmured behind him. More than any artist in history, another voice added with reverence. George had heard these statistics countless times, but they never quite captured what music had truly meant to him. It wasn't about the numbers or the accolades. It was about the connection, the stories, the lives touched by simple melodies and honest words. His wife Norma squeezed his hand gently, her touch grounding him as it had for over 50 years of marriage. She knew him better than anyone, understood his discomfort with excessive praise and his preference for letting the music speak for itself. They had weathered storms together that would have broken lesser relationships, finding strength in each other and in something greater than themselves. The host's voice boomed across the auditorium, interrupting George's quiet reflection. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored tonight to present a Lifetime Achievement Award to a man who has defined country music for generations. His authentic voice, unwavering integrity, and dedication to the craft have inspired countless artists and touched millions of hearts worldwide. As the introduction continued, George's mind wandered to the young musicians scattered throughout the audience. He recognized several faces, fresh-eyed singers and songwriters hungry for success, their dreams as bright as the stage lights above them. He remembered being in their position once, playing honky-tonks and dreaming of Nashville. The industry had changed dramatically since then, but the heart of country music remained the same, real stories told by real people. In the third row, a young woman named Sarah Martinez clutched her clipboard nervously. As a production assistant, she was responsible for coordinating the evening's technical aspects, but her mind was elsewhere tonight. The past few months had been a relentless struggle with depression and self-doubt. The competitive nature of the entertainment industry had worn her down, making her question her worth and purpose. She had been fighting dark thoughts for weeks, and tonight felt like a breaking point. Sarah watched George Strait with a mixture of admiration and envy. Here was a man who seemed to have it all figured out: success, respect, family, peace. She wondered if she would ever find that kind of stability in her own life, or if the constant pressure and rejection would eventually consume her entirely. Before you continue reading this incredible story, I want to take a moment to connect with you, our amazing audience. If this story is touching your heart, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think about George Strait's incredible journey. Your support means everything to us, and we love hearing your thoughts and experiences. Now, let's continue with this powerful tale. The applause grew thunderous as George slowly stood and made his way toward the stage. Each step felt heavier than usual, not from age or fatigue, but from the weight of expectation. The audience expected the usual gracious acceptance speech, humble gratitude, recognition of his team, perhaps a mention of his fans. What they didn't expect was the conversation that had been building in his heart for months. Backstage, music industry executives watched the monitors with satisfaction. Marcus Campbell, one of Nashville's most influential producers, scrolled through his phone while keeping one eye on the ceremony. He had built his career on understanding market trends and public opinion, and lately he had been concerned about artists who were too vocal about personal beliefs. In his view, modern audiences wanted entertainment, not sermons. "Another old-timer getting his due," Marcus muttered to his assistant, barely looking up from his device. "Let's hope he keeps it brief and non-controversial. The younger demographic doesn't connect with all that traditional stuff anymore." George reached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces before him. The Golden Award felt warm in his hands, its weight somehow insignificant compared to the words forming in his mind. He had planned a simple speech, something safe and appropriate for the occasion, but as he stood there surrounded by the glitter and glamour of an industry that had given him so much, he felt compelled to speak from a deeper place. The silence stretched for a moment longer than expected, creating an almost sacred pause in the evening's festivities. George's eyes found Norma in the audience, and she nodded slightly, understanding passing between them without words. He thought of Jennifer, his daughter who had been taken from them too soon, and the long journey of faith that had followed her death. "Thank you," George finally began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "This honor means more to me than I can express, but before I say anything else, I need to give credit where it's due." The audience leaned forward slightly, sensing something different in his tone. "Firstly, I want to thank Jesus Christ, my Savior, who gave me not just this talent, but a purpose for using it," George continued, his words deliberate and heartfelt. "Every song I've ever sung, every stage I've ever stood on, has been possible because of His grace and guidance in my life." The reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience like a stone dropped in still water. Some faces showed approval and support, while others displayed barely concealed discomfort. In the third row, Sarah looked up from her clipboard, surprised by the unexpected turn in the speech. Marcus Campbell's head snapped up from his phone, his expression shifting from boredom to irritation. He had seen this before, successful artists who felt the need to inject religion into entertainment, not understanding how it could damage their broad appeal. Without thinking, his voice carried further than he intended. "More country-fanatic religious nonsense," he said, just loud enough for the nearby microphones to catch. "This kind of thing doesn't sell anymore in today's market." The comment cut through the air like a blade, audible to those in the front rows and picked up by the sensitive sound equipment. Cameras automatically swiveled toward Marcus, then back to George, capturing the exact moment when the King of Country's expression changed. George's hands tightened slightly on the podium, his knuckles showing white against the polished wood. For a man who had faced personal tragedy with public dignity, who had navigated decades in the entertainment industry without scandal or controversy, the disrespect stung deeper than any professional criticism ever could. The audience held its collective breath, waiting to see how the legendary performer would respond to such a brazen interruption. Some expected him to ignore it and continue with his speech. Others thought he might cut his remarks short and return to his seat. No one anticipated what happened next. Instead of anger or defensiveness, something else flickered across George's weathered features, a profound sadness mixed with unmistakable resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore, he realized. This was about every artist who had ever felt. Pressured to hide their authentic selves for the sake of commercial success, every person who had been made to feel ashamed of their deepest beliefs. George carefully placed his award on the podium and took a deep breath that seemed to draw strength from some invisible source. When he looked up again, his eyes held a clarity and purpose that commanded attention from every person in that theater. "I understand that not everyone shares my faith," he said, his voice steady but carrying an emotional undercurrent that hadn't been there before. And I respect that. But what I'm about to share with you isn't about religion or marketing or sales figures. It's about the most difficult period of my life and how I almost lost everything that mattered to me. Sarah found herself setting down her clipboard entirely, drawn into the unexpected intimacy of the moment. Around the theatre, conversation stopped, phones were lowered, and even the most jaded industry veterans found themselves paying attention to something they sensed was about to become extraordinary. The king of country was about to remove his crown and reveal his heart, and somehow everyone in that room knew they were about to witness something that would change them forever. The silence in the Grand Ole Opry House became almost sacred as George Strait gathered his thoughts. His eyes, usually so controlled and measured, now held a vulnerability that few had ever witnessed. The weight of decades seemed to settle on his shoulders as he prepared to share something he had kept locked away for nearly 40 years. "When my daughter Jennifer died in 1986, George began, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow reaching every corner of the vast theatre, I didn't just lose my child. I lost my faith, my purpose, and very nearly my sanity." The admission hit the audience like a physical blow. Even those who knew George's personal history had never heard him speak so openly about Jennifer's death. Norma's hand went to her heart, remembering those dark months when she had feared losing her husband to grief as surely as she had lost her daughter to that terrible car accident. "Jennifer was just 13 years old," George continued, his voice gaining strength even as tears began to form in his eyes. "She was beautiful, smart, full of life and dreams. She wanted to be a veterinarian, loved horses more than anything in the world. When that drunk driver took her life, he didn't just kill my daughter, he shattered everything I thought I understood about God's plan." In the audience, Sarah Martinez felt her own eyes filling with tears. She had come to work tonight planning it to be her last, but something about George's raw honesty was cutting through her own despair in ways she hadn't expected. Marcus Campbell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly aware that his earlier comment had been not just inappropriate, but cruel. This wasn't the sanitized, media-friendly version of grief he was used to hearing from celebrities. This was real, unfiltered pain being shared by a man who had every right to keep it private. "For months after the funeral, I couldn't write a song," George admitted, his hands gripping the podium as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "I couldn't even listen to music. Every melody reminded me of Jennifer singing along in the car. Every lyric felt like a mockery of the faith I'd been raised with. I wrote dozens of songs during that period. Angry songs, bitter songs, songs full of questions that had no answers." He paused, looking directly at Marcus Campbell, his gaze holding no anger, only a profound sadness. "I questioned everything I had been taught about God's love, about his plan, about whether prayer meant anything at all. My wife found me one night, drunk and crying in my studio, surrounded by pages of lyrics that would never see the light of day. Songs with titles like "Where Were You, God?" and "13 Years Isn't Enough." I was ready to walk away from everything, music, faith, even my family. Norma wiped away tears, remembering that terrible night. She had found George sitting on the floor of his home studio at 3 a.m, empty whiskey bottles. Scattered around him, pages of desperate, angry lyrics covering every surface. It was the only time in their marriage she had truly feared she might lose him entirely. "Norma saved me during that time," George said, his voice breaking slightly as he looked at his wife. "She held our family together when I was falling apart. She never stopped believing, even when I had given up completely, but even her love and strength weren't enough to bring me back from that dark place." The theater was so quiet that the sound of people breathing seemed amplified. Camera operators found themselves wiping their own eyes as they continued to film what was becoming one of the most powerful moments in country music history. I stayed away from God for almost 2 years, George continued. I went through the motions, performed my concerts, smiled for the cameras, pretended everything was fine. But inside, I was empty. My music became mechanical, my performances felt hollow. I was going through the motions of being George Strait, while the real me was buried alongside my daughter. Sarah found herself leaning forward in her seat, hanging on every word. The pain George was describing felt familiar, resonating with her own feelings of emptiness and despair. She had been carrying her own burden of darkness for months, feeling like she was just going through the motions of living. Then something happened that changed everything, George said, his voice taking on a different quality. It was October of 1988, almost 2 years after Jennifer's death. I was in Dallas for a concert, staying at a hotel near the Children's Hospital. My manager got a call from a doctor there, asking if I might be willing to visit a young fan who was dying. The audience remained captivated, sensing they were about to hear something extraordinary. I almost said no, George admitted. I was tired, emotionally drained, and honestly, the thought of being around a sick child felt like more than I could handle. But something, maybe it was Norma's gentle pushing, maybe it was something deeper, made me change my mind. He took a deep breath, steadying himself for what came next. The boy's name was Tommy Richardson. He was 17 years old, had been fighting leukemia for 3 years, and the doctors had just told his family there was nothing more they could do. When I walked into his hospital room, I expected to find a broken, scared kid. Instead, I found someone who would teach me more about faith and courage than any preacher or theologian ever had. George's voice grew stronger as he continued, the memory clearly as vivid now as it had been 35 years ago. Tommy was so weak he could barely lift his head, but when he saw me, his face lit up like Christmas morning. He told me he had every one of my albums, that my music had been his constant companion during the worst parts of his treatment. He said listening to my songs helped him feel connected to something bigger than his hospital room. The emotion in George's voice was building, and several people in the audience were now openly crying. But then Tommy said something that stopped me cold. He looked at me with these eyes that seemed way too old for his 17-year-old face, and he said, "Mr. Strait, your music brought me closer to Jesus when I needed him most. I hope it's done the same for you." George paused, his own tears now flowing freely. I sat there, looking at this dying boy who somehow radiated more peace and faith than I had felt in 2 years, and I realized he was right. Even in my anger and doubt, even when I thought I had turned my back on God completely, my music had continued to carry messages of hope, love, and redemption. I had been so focused on my pain that I hadn't seen how God was still working through me, even in my darkest moments. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced in months. The young production assistant found herself thinking about her own battles with depression and hopelessness, wondering if maybe there was something she had been missing in her own pain. Tommy and I talked for 3 hours that night. George continued. He told me about his faith, about how he had learned to find joy even in suffering, about how he believed God had a purpose for every life, even ones that seemed cut short. When I finally got ready to leave, he grabbed my hand with what little strength he had left and said, "Promise me something, Mr. Strait. Promise me you'll keep singing about the things that matter. The world needs to hear about love, about family, about faith. Don't let your pain silence your gift." The theater was completely silent, except for the sound of quiet weeping throughout the audience. "Tommy Richardson died 3 days later," George said, his voice barely audible. But his words, his example, his unshakable faith in the face of death, they brought me back to life. I realized that my anger at God hadn't driven him away. He had been there all along, waiting patiently for me to find my way back home. George looked directly at Marcus Campbell again, his gaze now filled with compassion rather than hurt. That's when I understood that my music, my platform, my voice, they weren't just career tools. They were gifts from God, meant to be used for something greater than personal success or financial gain. Every song I've recorded since then, whether it mentions faith explicitly or not, has been infused with the values Tommy helped me rediscover. Love, hope, family, forgiveness, and the belief that every life has purpose and meaning. The transformation in the theater was palpable. What had started as a routine awards ceremony had become something approaching a revival meeting, with hardened industry professionals finding themselves moved to tears by the raw honesty of a man they thought they knew. But George wasn't finished. As he prepared to address Marcus Campbell's comment directly, something in his demeanor suggested that the most powerful part of his testimony was yet to come. "Sir," George said, turning his full attention to Marcus Campbell, his voice gentle but unwavering, "I heard your comment about my faith being bad for business, and I want to respond to that directly." Marcus felt every eye in the theater turn toward him, his face flushing red with embarrassment and anger. He had built his career on calculated risks and market analysis, but this public confrontation was spiraling beyond his control. "With all due respect," George continued, "I've been in this business for almost 50 years. I've seen trends come and go, watched artists compromise their authenticity for commercial success, and witnessed the consequences of putting profit over principle. What I've learned is that the most enduring music, the songs that truly matter, come from a place of absolute honesty." The conviction in George's voice was building, drawing strength from decades of experience and hard-won wisdom. "When I sing about love, I'm drawing from 52 years of marriage to the most incredible woman I've ever known. When I sing about family, I'm thinking about my children, my grandchildren, and yes, about Jennifer and how her memory continues to shape who I am. When I sing about heartbreak, I'm remembering the darkest nights of my soul. And when I sing about hope, I'm remembering Tommy Richardson and the dozens of fans who've shared their stories with me over the years." Sarah Martinez found herself nodding along with George's words, feeling a connection she hadn't expected. The authenticity he was describing was everything she had been searching for in her own life and career. "You're right that my faith doesn't sell to everyone," George acknowledged, his gaze still fixed on Marcus. "But it's not for sale. It's not a marketing strategy or a demographic calculation. It's the foundation of who I am, and it's informed every decision I've made, every song I've chosen to record, every value I've tried to live by." The theater remained spellbound as George's words gained momentum. "I've watched artists hide their beliefs, their values, their authentic selves, because they were told it wouldn't sell. I've seen talented people become hollow versions of themselves, chasing trends and focus groups instead of following their hearts. And you know what? Most of them don't last. The ones who endure, who build lasting careers and meaningful legacies, are the ones who stay true to who they are." George paused, his eyes scanning the audience filled with young artists and industry professionals. "Tommy Richardson taught me that music has the power to touch souls, not just move units. In that hospital room, I learned that authenticity resonates in ways that manufactured popularity never can. When people hear genuine emotion, real faith, honest struggle, that's when music becomes more than entertainment. It becomes healing." Marcus Campbell shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of hundreds of stares. He wanted to defend himself, to argue about market realities and demographic trends, But something about George's calm dignity made any rebuttal seem petty and hollow. "I understand the pressures of this industry," George continued, his tone becoming more inclusive. "I know there are bills to pay, careers to build, dreams to chase. But I also know that the most successful artists throughout history have been the ones who dared to be completely themselves, regardless of whether it was commercially safe." In the back of the theatre, veteran songwriter Margie Walsh wiped tears from her eyes. She had spent years hiding her own faith, worried it might limit her opportunities. Hearing George speak so openly about his beliefs was like receiving permission to be authentic again. "The same Bible that taught me about love and forgiveness also taught me never to deny the one who has never denied me, even in my darkest hours," George said, his voice growing stronger. "I won't hide my faith for the sake of sales figures or industry approval, but more than that, I won't judge others for their different beliefs or lack thereof." He looked directly at Marcus again, his expression softening. "What I will ask is that we treat each other's deeply held convictions with respect, even when we disagree. This industry is big enough for artists of all backgrounds, all faiths, all perspectives. What it's not big enough for is disrespect and dismissal of what makes each artist unique." The applause started slowly, beginning with an elderly woman in the balcony, then spreading throughout the theatre like ripples on a pond. But it wasn't the polite, obligatory applause typical of award ceremonies. This was something deeper: appreciation for courage, respect for authenticity, and recognition of a man who had chosen vulnerability over safety. As the applause continued, something unexpected happened. Sarah Martinez stood up from her seat, in the third row, her hands shaking as she clutched her clipboard. The young production assistant's movement caught the attention of nearby cameras, and gradually the applause died down as people noticed her standing. George, still at the podium, looked directly at Sarah with gentle curiosity. Something in her posture, the way she was trembling, suggested she had something important to say. "Sir," Sarah began, her voice barely audible even with the theatre's sensitive sound system, I need to say something." The silence that followed was different from the respectful quiet that had accompanied George's speech. This was charged with anticipation and concern, as everyone sensed they were about to witness something unscripted and potentially profound. Sarah's voice gained strength as she continued, "My name is Sarah Martinez, and I work as a production assistant here. Tonight, what you just said, about authenticity, about being true to yourself, I need you to know that it probably saved my life." Gasps echoed throughout the theatre as the weight of her words sank in. George's expression shifted from curiosity to deep concern, his pastoral instincts immediately engaged. "Last night," Sarah continued, her voice now carrying clearly through the silent theatre, "I made a decision that tonight would be my last day. I've been struggling with depression for months, feeling worthless in this industry, like I was invisible and expendable. I came to work today because it was my obligation, but I had already written goodbye letters to my family." Norma Strait's hand went to her mouth, her mother's heart breaking for this young woman she had never met. Around the theatre, industry professionals who had been focused on business and networking suddenly found themselves confronting the human cost of their competitive, often ruthless world. "I've been carrying this pain alone," Sarah said, tears now flowing freely down her face. "I felt like I had to pretend everything was fine, like admitting I was struggling would end my career before it even started. But listening to you talk about your own dark period, about finding your way back to faith and purpose, it made me realize that maybe I'm not as alone as I thought." George slowly stepped down from the podium, his award forgotten, his entire focus now on this young woman who was sharing her deepest struggle with a room full of strangers. "Hearing you defend your right to be authentic, to speak about what matters most to you even when it's not popular, It gave me permission to be honest about my own pain. For the first time in months, I feel like maybe there's a reason to keep fighting. Maybe there's hope I haven't seen yet." The theatre erupted in applause again, but this time it was different. People weren't just clapping for George's courage. They were supporting Sarah's incredible bravery in sharing her story. Several audience members were openly weeping, moved by the raw honesty of the moment. Marcus Campbell found himself standing and applauding, his earlier cynicism completely dissolved. The producer who had dismissed faith as bad for business was now witnessing its power to literally save lives. He realized that his comment hadn't just been disrespectful, it had been dangerously short-sighted. George reached Sarah's row and extended his hand to her. "May I come sit with you for a moment?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, unable to speak through her tears. As George made his way into the row, the entire theatre remained standing, witnessing something that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of the sacred. The King of Country was about to become exactly what Tommy Richardson had inspired him to be, not just an entertainer, but a source of hope and healing for someone who desperately needed both. George sat down beside Sarah, his presence somehow making the massive theatre feel intimate and safe. The cameras continued to roll, but everyone seemed to forget they were being filmed. This wasn't a performance anymore. It was a moment of genuine human connection unfolding in real time. "Sarah," George said softly, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that had comforted countless fans over the decades. "I want you to know that what you just did took more courage than anything I've ever done on any stage. Speaking your truth, especially when you're hurting, is one of the bravest acts a person can perform." Sarah looked up at him through her tears, seeing not the famous country star, but a father figure whose own pain had taught him how to recognize it in others. "Oh, I feel so lost," she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the silent theater. "I came to Nashville with such big dreams, but this industry, it's so hard. Every day feels like a rejection, like proof that I'm not good enough, that I'll never be good enough." George nodded knowingly. "I understand that feeling more than you might think. After Jennifer died, I felt exactly the same way, like I wasn't good enough to be her father, wasn't good enough to protect her, wasn't good enough for God to spare her life." Around them, the audience remained captivated, many seeing their own struggles reflected in Sarah's words. In the entertainment industry, vulnerability was often seen as weakness, but tonight it was becoming a source of unexpected strength. "But here's what Tommy Richardson taught me," George continued, "and what I want to share with you. Your worth isn't determined by your success in this business. It's not measured by how many people know your name, or how much money you make, or what awards you win. Your worth comes from something much deeper, from the fact that you were created with purpose, with unique gifts that only you can offer the world." Marcus Campbell, still standing in his row, found himself deeply moved by the conversation unfolding before him. He thought about all the young artists he had dismissed over the years, all the dreams he had crushed with careless comments about marketability and commercial viability. He had built his career on judging people's worth by their potential profitability, never considering the human cost of his calculations. "Sarah," George said, taking her hand gently, "I want to tell you something that might sound strange. When you stood up tonight and shared your story, you did something more powerful than any song I've ever sung. You showed everyone in this room that authenticity and vulnerability can break through walls that success and fame never could." Sarah's tears were still flowing, but something in her posture had changed. The defeated slump in her shoulders was gradually being replaced by a tentative hope. "You see all these people here tonight?" George gestured toward the audience. "Look at their faces, really look at them." Sarah raised her head and looked around the theatre. What she saw surprised her. Instead of judgment or pity, she saw recognition, empathy, and respect. Veteran performers were wiping away tears, young artists were nodding in understanding, and industry executives were looking at her with newfound respect. "Every single person in this room has felt lost at some point," George continued. "Every one of them has questioned their worth, their purpose, their reason for being here. The difference is, most of them have never had the courage to admit it publicly. You just gave them permission to acknowledge their own struggles." In the balcony, songwriter Margie Walsh stood up and began to applaud again. She was thinking about her own battles with self-doubt, her own moments of despair when rejection letters piled up and dreams seemed impossible. Seeing Sarah's courage was inspiring her own. One by one, other audience members began standing and applauding. But this wasn't applause for entertainment. It was applause for courage, for honesty, for the kind of authenticity that George had been talking about. "You know what I think?" George said, his voice carrying clearly through the theater even without the microphone. "I think God brought you to this moment, to this place, for a reason, not just to hear what you needed to hear, but to say what everyone else needed to hear." Marcus Campbell could no longer remain silent. The producer, who had started this entire sequence with his dismissive comment about faith, walked down from his row toward where George and Sarah were sitting. The theater watched in fascination as the man who had embodied industry cynicism approached the scene of transformation. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice humble and uncertain. I owe both of you an apology." George looked up at him with compassion rather than anger. "Marcus, isn't it? I've heard good things about your work." "My work," Marcus repeated bitterly. "My work has been about treating people like commodities, judging artists by their commercial potential instead of their human worth. What I said earlier about your faith was not just disrespectful, it was cruel and ignorant." He turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with genuine regret, and watching what just happened, seeing how your courage has affected everyone here, I realize that my approach to this business has been fundamentally wrong. Sarah looked up at him, still processing the sudden turn of events. "I want to offer you more than just an apology," Marcus continued. "I want to offer you an opportunity. My production company is looking for someone with real insight into what artists need, someone who understands the human side of this business. Your honesty tonight showed me something I've been missing for years." George smiled, recognizing the work of providence in the moment. "Sarah, this is what I meant about purpose. Sometimes our greatest pain becomes our greatest qualification to help others." But Sarah's response surprised everyone. Instead of immediately accepting the offer, she looked thoughtful. "Mr. Campbell, I appreciate your offer more than you. No, but I need to ask you something. If you hire me, will I be expected to hide my struggles, to pretend everything is perfect? Because I can't do that anymore. Tonight taught me that authenticity is more important than image." Marcus paused, considering her question seriously. "Sarah, I think that's exactly why I need you. This industry has spent too long creating polished facades while ignoring the real human beings behind them. Maybe it's time for someone like you to help change that." The conversation between the three of them was being heard throughout the theater, broadcast live to millions of viewers who had tuned in expecting a routine awards show. Instead, they were witnessing something unprecedented, a real-time transformation of both individuals and industry culture. George stood up, helping Sarah to her feet. "You know what I think we should do?" he said to the entire theater. "I think we should take a moment to recognize that what happened here tonight is bigger than any award, any song, any career achievement." He gestured towards Sarah and Marcus. "We just witnessed the power of honesty to break down walls, create connections, and transform hearts. That's what music is supposed to do. That's what faith is supposed to do. That's what being human is supposed to do. The applause that followed was different from anything that had happened that evening. It wasn't polite or obligatory or even enthusiastic. It was grateful. Everyone in that theatre seemed to understand that they had been part of something that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of the sacred. As the applause continued, George looked out at the sea of faces and realized that Tommy Richardson's words from 35 years ago were still echoing through time. The young man who had died believing that music could change lives was still changing lives, still inspiring hope, still proving that authenticity could triumph over artifice. But even as this profound moment was unfolding, George sensed that the evening's surprises weren't over. The transformation that had begun with his defense of faith was rippling outward in ways that none of them could have predicted. As the applause finally began to fade, George returned to the podium to conclude his acceptance speech, but the man who stood there now was different from the one who had begun speaking 30 minutes earlier. The vulnerability he had shown, the connections he had made, had somehow made him more regal, not less. This was what true leadership looked like, not commanding from a distance, but walking alongside others through their struggles. "Before I close tonight," George said, his voice carrying new authority, "I want to say something to all the young artists in this audience and to everyone watching at home who has a dream they're afraid to pursue authentically." The cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing the wisdom earned through decades of both triumph and tragedy. Don't let anyone convince you that you have to choose between success and integrity. Don't let anyone tell you that your deepest beliefs, your strongest convictions, your most authentic self are obstacles to overcome rather than gifts to embrace. The world doesn't need another manufactured artist trying to be what they think will sell. The world needs you, the real you, with all your imperfections, struggles, and genuine heart. In the audience, dozens of young musicians found themselves sitting straighter, feeling a courage they hadn't possessed an hour earlier. George's words weren't just advice. They were permission to be themselves in an industry that often demanded conformity. Sarah Martinez showed us tonight that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the courage to be human in a world that often prefers pretense. Marcus Campbell showed us that it's never too late to change, to grow, to choose compassion over calculation. And all of you, by witnessing this moment with open hearts, have shown that audiences hunger for authenticity more than perfection. George picked up his award again, holding it with new appreciation for what it represented. "This award means more to me now than when I first received it tonight, because it's no longer just recognition of my career. It's become a symbol of what happens when we choose truth over comfort, when we choose connection over image, when we choose faith over fear." The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, but it was Sarah Martinez who provided the evening's final surprise. As the applause continued, she walked to the microphone that had been set up for audience questions. "Excuse me," she said, her voice now strong and clear. "I have something I'd like to say." The theatre quieted, eager to hear from the young woman who had already shown such remarkable courage. "Mr. Strait, what you did tonight saved my life, literally, but I want everyone here to know that this isn't where my story ends. It's where it begins. I came to Nashville to work in music, but I thought that meant hiding who I really am, pretending to be someone I'm not." She paused, looking around the theatre with new confidence. "Tonight taught me that authenticity isn't just personally important. It's professionally essential. Real artists create real connections with real people. Everything else is just noise." Sarah turned to Marcus Campbell, who was still standing near George's row. "Mr. Campbell, I accept your job offer, but I want to propose something bigger. What if we created a program within your company specifically designed to support artists' mental health and authentic self-expression? What if we made it safe for people to be vulnerable, to struggle, to be human while pursuing their dreams? Marcus's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. Sarah, I think that's exactly what this industry needs. And I think you're exactly the person to lead it. The theater erupted in applause again, but this time it was celebratory rather than emotional. Everyone could sense that they had witnessed not just a moment of personal transformation, but the birth of something that could change the industry itself. As the ceremony officially concluded and people began to file out, something remarkable happened. Instead of the usual networking and small talk, people were having deep, meaningful conversations. The authenticity that George had modeled and Sarah had demonstrated was spreading through the crowd like a gentle contagion. Margie Walsh approached a group of young songwriters she had previously ignored, offering to mentor them. A veteran producer publicly apologized to an artist he had treated dismissively years earlier. Two competitors in the same genre shook hands and agreed to collaborate rather than compete. George and Norma were preparing to leave when they were approached by a representative from a major television network. "Mr. Strait," the executive said, "we've never seen anything like what happened here tonight. Our switchboard has been flooded with calls from viewers saying this was the most meaningful television they've ever watched. Would you consider doing a monthly program where you interview artists about their authentic journeys, their struggles and triumphs?" George looked at Norma, who nodded encouragingly. "Only if Sarah Martinez can be my co-host," George replied. "She has insights into this generation of artists that I could never provide alone." Sarah, overhearing the conversation, felt her heart racing with excitement and terror. "I don't know anything about hosting television shows," she said honestly. "You know about being real," George replied. "Everything else can be learned." 3 months later, Authentic Voices with George Strait and Sarah Martinez premiered. To the highest ratings any music program had achieved in decades. The show featured artists talking honestly about their struggles, their faith or lack thereof, their mental health challenges, and their authentic creative processes. The program sparked a movement throughout the entertainment industry. Record labels began prioritizing artist authenticity over manufactured image. Mental health resources became standard offerings for entertainment companies. Young artists started sharing their struggles openly rather than hiding them. Marcus Campbell's production company became the first in Nashville to offer comprehensive mental health support for all employees and artists. The program Sarah developed became a model copied by companies throughout the entertainment world. But perhaps the most significant change was in George Strait himself. The man who had spent decades being private about his personal life became one of the most influential voices for authenticity and faith in entertainment. He didn't preach or proselytize. He simply lived openly, showing others that success and authenticity could coexist beautifully. 5 years after that transformative night in Nashville, Sarah Martinez stood on the same Grand Ole Opry stage, now as a successful television host and advocate for mental health in the entertainment industry. She was presenting an award to a young artist who had publicly shared his struggle with depression and credited Sarah's advocacy work with saving his life. 5 years ago, I came to this theater planning to end my life, Sarah said to the packed audience. Instead, I found it. I found it because one man had the courage to speak authentically about his faith, and because an industry full of people discovered that vulnerability creates connection in ways that perfection never could. In the audience, George Strait wiped away tears of pride and gratitude. At 75, he had thought his most impactful days were behind him. Instead, that night had launched the most meaningful chapter of his career. Tommy Richardson's words, spoken in a hospital room 37 years earlier, continued to echo through time. Keep singing about the things that matter. The world needs to hear about love, about family, about faith. Don't let your pain silence your gift. George had kept that promise, and in doing so, he had helped create a world where other artists could do the same. The King of Country had built a kingdom not of crowns and accolades, but of authenticity and hope. As the evening concluded and George walked off the stage for what everyone knew might be his final public appearance, he carried with him the satisfaction of a life well lived and a legacy that would inspire generations of artists to choose truth over comfort, authenticity over artifice, and faith over fear. The story that began with a dismissive comment about faith had become a testament to its power to transform not just individuals, but entire industries. And somewhere in heaven, a 17-year-old boy named Tommy Richardson was smiling, knowing that his words had continued to change the world long after his voice had been silenced.